Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you're having a great week. Now, Jim, we've authored quite a number of books, but you wrote two in particular that were centered around the profiles of particular slices of our society. You wrote The Rise of the Nuns, which are about those in our country who just prefer not to identify themselves with any particular religion. And then you also wrote Meet Generation Z, which is about Generation Z, but it gives readers a look inside the world of Gen Z and their cultural context, the way that they think, and most importantly, their relationship with God and faith. Now, there's another generation that sociologists and marketers are paying close attention to now, and that's Generation Alpha. Jim, who falls into Generation Alpha? Why the term Alpha, and how large is this demographic?
You know, the three big generational groups that most people are familiar with are baby boomers, followed by baby busters, or Generation X, followed by millennials, also known as Generation Y. The newest cohort receiving attention following them was Generation Z, those born between roughly 1995 and 2010. Social scientists quibble on a year or two on that, but basically that 15-year timeframe. As you mentioned, my own book, Meet Generation Z, was designed to introduce the distinguishing marks of that cohort, currently the largest of the generations, and how they can be reached for Christ. But it is time to start talking about what's coming, and that would be the generation that follows Generation Z, Generation Alpha. Generation Alpha are those born beginning in roughly 2010, the same year Apple debuted the iPad. And the oldest is around 13 or 14 right now. And the youngest will be born the coming year. So those born between, say, 2010 and 2024. They are called Generation Alpha, as in Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. They are the Alpha, the beginning, because they will be, as some have said, the first generation raised in a new world of technological integration. There's another reason why they're called Generation Alpha, why most people didn't have any problem with it, was because you had Generation Y, Generation Z. Okay, we got to start back over at the alphabet now. And they are the tech-savvy young children of millennials. I mean, that's the easiest way to put it. They're large. Mark McCrindle, who is a social researcher in Australia, was the one who first coined, let's give him credit, the one who coined the term Generation Alpha. And he estimates that about 2.5 million of them are born every week. He also sets 2025 as the last year that we can say sociologically that alphas will be born. By then, McCrindle estimates that there'll be more than 2 billion of them on the planet. This will make them the largest generation, larger than Generation Z, which will reach 1.8 billion globally at that time. So they are on course to be the largest generation in the history of the world. They will shape the social media landscape as a result. They'll become the popular cultural influencers. They'll, of course, be emerging consumers and shape that market. They are already beginning to move into the workforce and potential adulthood, as they enter their teenage years. So, yeah, that's a quick snapshot.
Now, before we get into the specifics of Gen Alpha, I want to ask a broader question. Why does it seem that only recently demographic brackets are making such big waves? And I'm thinking specifically of millennials and Gen Z, now Alpha. Certainly, sociologists have grouped people demographically before. They've given labels to those generations. But I never felt that those labels were as talked about or as important, at least in mainstream kind of circles, as they are now. Now, is this just a bias of my youth, or is this truly the case?
Actually, the whole cottage industry around generations started with baby boomers. That was the first modern generation really singled out and studied, and for good reason. They were called baby boomers because there was a real boom in births, and it was forming the largest generation in modern history. Nothing like it had ever really happened before. That led to a rush to study them as a cohort and to make all kinds of predictions about them and to try and understand all about them. But that actually is a little problematic, or proved to be problematic, because it confused a generation with a culture. And what I mean is that, and we can talk more about this, is that we can make the challenge about reaching Gen Z or reaching Gen A, make that the challenge, reaching that generation, which to a point is fair. But the larger issue is understanding our larger culture that's shaping all generations. And in our case, that is the post-Christian world, and that we're really reaching post-Christians, which cuts across all generations.
That's a good point. Okay, so let's go back to Gen Alpha or Gen A, as you said. Give us a glimpse into the world that they're growing up in, and what, as a result, has made them unique among previous generations.
Okay, those are two different questions.
Okay.
So let me separate them.
Yep.
Let's start off with the world in which they have grown up. It isn't hard. Really, it isn't hard at all to consider the influences on their lives. They will not remember a world without COVID-19. COVID cemented online interaction as a norm for kids. Not only have they attended virtual school, but they also have a larger share of their parents now working from home as a byproduct of that. They are behind earlier generations when it comes to having experience with making friends and being exposed to new environments. They'll never know anything other than the constant use of iPhones and iPads. Their social world will know little outside of social media, quite honestly. They will have lived with the anxiety of climate change from their earliest awareness. As children, they have more material things than at their disposal than any other generation in history. They are and will continue to be, as mentioned, the most technologically savvy generation ever. They will enjoy a longer lifespan than any previous generation. It's been predicted that they will likely spend more years in education, begin their work lives later, and possibly live with their parents even longer than either Gen Z or Gen Y. But I would argue that that their primary defining mark, I really do think, is technological. They are the first entirely online generational cohort. Some have dubbed them the iPad kids. Millennial parents are giving their kids their first smartphones at around 9 years old. That's the average. 79% of their parents say that their kids are currently on social media. 44% say their kids watch video content on a smartphone at least weekly. Like earlier generations, they are experiencing a media-centric childhood, but they're interacting with a very different kind of media than any other generation, and from a very young age. For example, artificial intelligence. It's too early to know how that's going to mark them, but we can note that Siri and Alexa have been in their parents' home for most of their lives, and ChatGPT is being used in schools as we speak as a learning tool. It goes without saying that Generation Alpha will be the first generation to have only known a world where the line between AI and the human has been permanently blurred. Another aspect of the technological difference and influence is the rise of platforms such as TikTok, which has shaped and is shaping their lives. Now, this is very important for other generations to remember. This is distinct from how Facebook changed millennials or shaped millennials. Facebook was pre-algorithm and largely exposed you simply to networks of family and networks of friends. A post-algorithm platform such as TikTok exposes users to anyone and everyone. But now to your second question. How is this going to make them unique? Well, I think the jury is still out on that. It's just way too early. Nobody wants it to be too early. You'll read all kinds of predictions about what Generation Alpha is going to be like, and I would just tell people to be careful, very careful. This is the mistake we made with studying the boomers. We started too early. We drew our conclusions way too soon. We didn't account for things like the change that takes place as people grow up and mature. And also how culture, whatever is happening there, tends to shape human beings as it develops and changes. For example, let's bracket off how culture is going to shape. Let's just talk about how people change as they mature. Once 20-somethings get married and have a child, not all do, but if they do get married and have a child, oh my goodness, they begin to look, feel, and act very, very differently. A massive change occurs in taste and demeanor and schedule and priorities when a 20-something person gets married and then has a child. That really shouldn't shock us that there are changes in development. Just again, think about the baby boomers. Let me put it in a way that will kind of startle us into realizing how careful we have to be. It was the Woodstock generation that grew up and gave us the Reagan era. But if you had studied the 60s on a surface level, tie-dyed T-shirts, long hair, Led Zeppelin, you would have never forecast the button-down, brie-eating, Gucci-wearing, Celine Dion listening yuppie. But make no mistake, it was the hippies who became the yuppies. That's who they were. So we need to move carefully here.
Well, I feel like I might want to retract the next question I planned to ask you, but I'll just ask it anyway. Because I was going to ask that, what kind of mark do you think that they're going to have on culture and community as they come into adulthood?
Well, as I said, I think it is a bit early for that, but it's worth hazarding some guesses. I mean, there are some reasonable guesses because they will be the influencers, not simply the influence that is capturing the imagination of so many. And there is the sheer number of them. As mentioned, they are on course to be the largest generation in the history of the world. They will shape the social media landscape. They'll become popular cultural influencers, and of course, as I mentioned, be emerging consumers. I think there are two headlines that we can mention, and both of these. Remember how I said it's hard to chart how you need to remember how people change as they age, but the other influence is culture itself on them. Well, I think that's almost safer ground for looking at what they're going to be like and what marks. So let me just give you two. They're going to be the first generation and to have almost unlimited access to information and almost no access to wisdom. So their influence will be sketchy, quite frankly, and potentially met with hubris. I've got a blog. I don't know when this is going to hit, but as we speak, I have a blog coming out. Just in preparation of a new poll that found that a stunning number of people who are younger feel like they can write self-help books for the rest of the world. And yet it's based on information, not wisdom. And even that information itself has been Googled, which is, skeptical. So I think that's first. The second thing is we have to remember they're the first generation to grow up in a post-Christian context, fully, from start to finish. I would say Gen Z kind of falls into that category too, but Gen A is like lock, stock, and barrel. So spiritual moorings will be largely non-existent.
I want to camp out on that a little bit more. What type of religious upbringing have they had? What might the church expect to be the result of that?
Well, let's unpack that carefully. First, who is influencing them? The answer is easy. Influencers, largely coming to them on social media through TikTok and YouTube. And then there are their parents. Parents who, and this is very important to remember about Generation Alpha, their parents are the ones who really have made up the rise of the nuns. It doesn't mean that they won't be an open generation when it comes to spiritual things, but we can count on spiritual and biblical illiteracy and a pluralistic mindset when it comes to matters of faith. So as I've often argued, there's going to be two keys to connect with them. The first is, and let me just kind of, and I would almost argue this is in general how we're going to connect with our culture too, not just Generation Alpha, but Generation Alpha is going to be the poster child. So let me just talk in a broad way. The first is that we've got to capture a new understanding of evangelism, one that sees evangelism as both process and event. What I mean by that is that when somebody comes to saving faith in Christ, there's both an adoption process and an actual decision event at the end. And for decades, evangelism capitalized on a very unique state of affairs, namely a culture filled with people who were relatively advanced in their spiritual knowledge, spiritual background, and as a result, they were able to quickly and responsibly consider the event of accepting Jesus as both leader and forgiver. In light of today's realities, there has to be a fresh attention paid to the process that leads people to the event of, evaluating Christ for their life. The goal is not simply knowing how to articulate the means of coming to Christ, but also to facilitate and enable a person along the process toward that, where they're able to even consider accepting Christ for their life. You have to have a context where they can have that journey encouraged and have that journey served, which leads to another significant rethinking, which is at the heart of that process is going to involve explanation. A biblical paradigm that I've used many, many times to try to explain this to people is that we have moved from an Acts 2 cultural context to an Acts 17 cultural context, which means we need an Acts 17 approach. In Acts 2, you have Peter before the God-fearing Jews of Jerusalem. And in that exchange, his message was pretty straightforward. I mean, he says, you know all about creation. You know all about Adam and Eve and the fall. You know about Abraham and the chosen people of Israel. You know all about Moses and the law. You know all about the prophets and the promised coming of the Messiah. We don't need to waste time on all that. You know all that, and you believe the Bible, the Old Testament, is the inspired, authoritative Word of God. So we're clear on that. You've got all that in you from childhood. Great. What you need to know is that Jesus was that Messiah. You rejected it and killed him. He's risen again. He's unleashed his church, which means you screwed up and you need to repent. That was it. Not even the length of a good blog. And thousands did. Thousands. Peter was able to speak to a group of people who were already monotheists, who already bought into the Old Testament scriptures, who already believed in a coming Messiah that would be from the line of David. I mean, I'd give your eye teeth for someone like that today. Now move forward to Acts 17. Here is Paul on Mars Hill, speaking to the philosophers and spiritual agnostics of Athens. Here was a spiritual marketplace where truth was relative and worldviews and gods littered the landscape, and the average person, had no background. Paul knew he was not in Jerusalem anymore, so he did not take an Acts 2 approach or give an Acts 2 message. He was a better missiologist than that. Instead, he tried to find a way to connect with the culture of that day and the people in it. So he looked for that, famous touchstone, an altar to an unknown God. And a lot of people wonder what that was. Well, the culture was so pluralistic that the only thing you could agree on was that you couldn't know anything for sure. That's the only thing we can agree on, is that you can't know anything. So he said, so that's why there was this altar to the unknown God, in the midst of Athens. So he said, well, what if I could tell you that God's name? Would that be of interest to you? How would that be for my entry into this conversation? And then he went all the way back to creation. It was a brilliant, brilliant presentation, and began to work its way forward, laying a foundation for the understanding and acceptance of the gospel. Different culture, different approach. And that's precisely where we find ourselves today. We're not speaking to the God-fearing Jews in Jerusalem. We're speaking to the folks on Mars Hill. We need an Acts 17 mindset. We need an Acts 17 strategy, which means our primary cultural currency is going to need to be explanation. It's not enough to move from a King James version of the Bible to the NIV or to Eugene Peterson's The Message. We've got to stand in front of people and say, this is a Bible. That's 66 books. There's an Old Testament, a New Testament. It tells the story of us and God. And then we need to explain that story. We're so used to talking to the already convinced that we have no intuitive sense of what it means to talk to someone who isn't. And so I think that when it comes to Generation Alpha, this is going to be absolutely strategic to remember.
Well, since millennials are the parents of Gen Alpha, and I have no doubt that we have quite a number of millennials, myself included, listening to this episode, what might you want them to take away from the current Gen Alpha observations, predictions, what you've mentioned today? I'm all ears, by the way. I've got 4 of these.
So you're giving me a pastor / father / grandfather moment.
Oh, please. Yeah.
Okay. Here's what you need to settle in the deepest part of who you are as a parent. The deepest part of what you believe as a parent and the deepest conviction you hold as a parent. Is your faith, a matter of personal taste or transcendent truth. If it's just your taste, then it's not any different than a favorite color or the food that you like to eat or the kind of music that you enjoy listening to. Are you a beach person? Are you a mountain person? Whether you like football or basketball better, it's all preference. You like Jesus, someone else like Buddha, someone else Muhammad. It's no big deal. It's just taste. But if it's not about taste, but about truth, then it all changes. Then it becomes electric. If it's about truth, then you're actually battling for your child's very soul and their eternity. It's about right and wrong, good and evil, heaven and hell. It's about where they stand before a living God. It's about, again, where they will spend eternity. But if this is all about taste, pop a cold one and relax. You let them chart it all out on their own in the most laissez-faire, laid back, whatever kind of approach, possible, because it just doesn't matter. You don't really believe in heaven and hell anyway. You don't really believe there's going to be much that happens after this life that isn't sorted out just fine. You don't believe there's going to be anything but good, or it all works out. You don't believe there's anything deeper than personal fulfillment. It's all just taste. But if it's about truth, well, then if it's about reality, if there really is a God on the loose and he's made himself ultimately known through Jesus, and it's only through Jesus that you can be in a saving relationship with the living God, then this becomes the most important investment and responsibility of all. There's nothing else in the parenting world that even comes close to your child and their faith. Yes, your child will eventually have to make their own choice, but if it's about truth, you're going to want to do everything that you possibly can to help them make that choice. And that means that when they are too young to choose, you choose for them, which is the way all parenting works. I don't know why people understand parenting, that this is the way it works in every area, but when it comes to spiritual things, all of a sudden they act like they don't know what to do. Would you let your child put their hand on a hot stove while saying to yourself, well, let's just let him see for himself whether it's hot or not? Would you let him walk out into traffic and say, well, he needs to make his own decision about whether it's bad to get hit by a car? Would you give your 2-year-old a fork and say, listen, I really don't want to push my views on you in regard to what you should put into an electrical socket, so you'll have to make that choice on your own, but I am going to help you with that because I'm broad-minded, so here's a fork, and there's the socket. Absolutely insane. They just don't have the maturity to make those kinds of decisions at that point in their lives. They need you to tell them what you believe to the core of your being, what you've learned through your life experiences about what is right and wrong, true and good, safe and not safe, what to believe, what not to believe. Why would you drop Parenting 101 and common sense when it comes to the most important aspect of life of all? So let me get real nuts and bolts about this. If this is truth for you, then that means that when they are young, you don't ask your child if they want you to read them a Bible story. You just read it to them. You don't ask them if they want to say their prayers. You say prayers with them. You don't ask them if they want to go to church. You take their scrawny little butt to church. Now, some are wondering how that plays out for middle school and high school. Well, obviously, it changes. There's 3 stages that you need to consciously maneuver as a parent. 3 stages in terms of how you play out the intentionality of faith and family. The first stage is when you intentionally indoctrinate them. The word indoctrinate has a bad connotation to some, but it shouldn't when it comes to your child. Oh my goodness, it simply means put doctrine in. Put truth in. Instruct and teach certain beliefs. That's your job. So in the early years, indoctrinate. Then as they get older, intentionally educate. Help them to understand it all. Help them to connect dots, not only know what they believe, but why. And the best education is going to come through conversations that you will have. So explain things to them. Help them to not just know it, but to get it. They're going to have questions. Encourage those questions. Don't be intimidated by them. And for goodness sakes, don't shut them down. Talk about it with them. The greatest threat to faith for a child isn't doubt. It's doubt met by silence or condemnation. Your children, particularly as they age, need to be able to express their questions and concerns and doubts about faith. You know that latest surveys, Alexis, and we'll put this in the show notes, find that 70% of all church-going high schoolers, let me repeat that, 70% of all church-going high schoolers report having serious doubts about faith. You know what I would say to them? That's so normal. Doubt away. Ask away. That's legal, because if it's true, it'll stand up under any amount of intellectual scrutiny. Anybody tells you something different, they don't get it. And you know what I would say to their parents? Be normal. Don't get all weird on them. Let them ask. Let them doubt. Let them, sort through it and help them sort through it. See, doubt is not unbelief. This is so often confusing to people. The very meaning of doubt is that you're in two minds. That's what doubt itself as a word means. You're in two minds. You're wavering, you're deciding, you're processing things, which is normal. I just wish parents would think about taking their high schooler out to coffee and asking them probing spiritual questions, having intentionally these questions, generating them, being a catalyst for them. Questions like, what is something you don't believe that you think I still believe? It's a great question. Here's another one. What is something you believe that you don't think I believe? When do you feel closest to God? Do you still believe in God? And on the questions go. If they say no or I'm not sure, then say, you know what? Well, tell me about this God you don't believe in. I'd really love to hear about it. And then probably what you'll be able to say is, you know what, son, I don't believe in that God either. That's and you're able to, because their view of God has become so distorted by culture and its caricatures as opposed to the true biblical image. Well, after you indoctrinate and after you educate, the final stage is to then help them navigate, to make ultimate and final choices, to help them find their way spiritually, to encourage them toward following true north, help them along the way as they journey through life, become spiritual friend, spiritual cheerleader, spiritual coach, spiritual mentor, and director to them, which can and hopefully be a role, if you play your cards right relationally, you can play throughout the rest of your life with them as a parent, no matter how old your child is. And you can play that role until, God takes you home.
Well, thank you, Jim. I'm sure that Gen Alpha are going to make their way into future conversations as we continue to learn more about them. This is a great primer. It's so eye-opening to realize what world they are living in, how they're experiencing the world. Gosh, how different our worldview might be from them, and I experience that on a daily basis with my own children. But it's nice to be able to study it a little bit more and figure out how to meet them where they are and where we might want to lead them. So thank you for this. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you again next week.